There are lots of hadiths which show that barriers didn't exist at the time of the Prophet. For example, some men had clothes that were so short the Prophet asked the women to delay their rising from prostration. This gave the men enough time to pull their shirts down. If a woman had trouble hearing in the mosque, it was no big deal to ask a man to repeat what was said. In fact, women could even speak up in the mosque. Omar, the second caliph, tried to limit the mahr, which is a monetary gift a man gives to a woman before marriage. A woman spoke up and challenged Omar with a verse from the Quran. Women also had active social lives outside the mosque. They participated in the military. Omar even appointed a woman to be an arbiter in the marketplace, which was a very public area. And men who were away on missions were ordered to return to their homes within 4 months to satisfy the needs of their wives. But aren't those examples that the problems of fitna that the men are so worried about today, that the men will look at the beautiful women, the women will see us. All those issues that they worry about actually happened during the time of the Prophet.
Yes, they did.
And he never dealt with it with a physical barrier. He never, ever dealt with it.
That's a beautiful point. That's exactly the point. As a matter of fact, the Prophet, peace be upon him, there's so much evidence for the lack of barrier. The so-called legal scholars assume positions that it is categorically forbidden for a woman to travel by herself for any purpose. So you mean to tell me that all these masters who are women imams, who traveled the Muslim world, they were teachers in the public masajid?
Were they behind curtains?
No.
No?
Some of them were on the minbar themselves. Fatima bint Abbas was so eminent in her time. She was a contemporary of Ibn Taymiyyah. And she taught from the minbar.
She sat on the minbar and she taught the men.
She taught men and women.
And did she?
No.
And her face was uncovered.
Yeah.
And was she an old woman? Some men say to me, oh well, she's probably so old it didn't.
No, she was very young actually. The women of Medinan society actually were more revolutionary than their granddaughters in the modern Muslim world.
91% of Muslims living in Canada were born and raised in Muslim countries. Only 10% actually grew up here. I'm a minority in my own community. This means that mosques cater to many Muslims who are used to barriers. So where does this leave women of my generation? I went with my friends to listen to Professor Asma Barlas, who talked about the importance of equality in Islam.
There is not a single verse that suggests that men's gender roles are a function of their biology or that biological differences between men and women make them unequal. Now, it is true that the Quran treats women and men differently with respect to certain issues, but that doesn't mean that it establishes them as being unequal. We will be unable to change anything unless, as the Quran says, we begin by changing what is in our own hearts and by opening them to the truth.
Islam views women as spiritual equals, but Muslim men do make many distinctions, and that's what frustrates women of my generation.
I find it absurd to be made to feel that some brother in the congregation might find the sight or sound of me arousing, when I have a 17-year-old son, and that's the median age of the guys in the congregation. I mean, if you find me arousing, you've got problems I can't help you with. I'm not interested.
But I remember in the MSA, it's during Jummah when I was an undergraduate, there was an issue about even what was being announced in the Friday Jummah. They used to announce sisters swimming, happening in a building. And some of the men objected because it created images in their minds. Now, why they're coming to prayer and their mind is in the gutter is another story. But, even the very mention of something relating to women being publicly announced was considered to be an interruption for these men or distracting. And, I think that we have for too long allowed these kinds of excuses to silence us and to subjugate us.
I think there's this unsurmountable fear of, when the women start speaking, the doors of the mosques will be collapsing. And we need to appease that. We need to address that. We're reclaiming our space.
In this culture, whatever segregation might mean in some other culture, here it means inferiority.
And here it is a system of gendered apartheid.
Yeah, I mean, there is such a pressure not to air the dirty laundry. But the fact that some people are coming out and airing it, to me, I think is a very hopeful sign.
Wow. If you're really doing prayer, all right, if you're really in communion with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, somebody should be able to walk by in a bikini and it's not going to faze you. It's childish. And it's really degrading to men to say that men are so weak that they can't resist a little, you know, look here or there. I mean, it's very degrading, and men who say that about each other, that's horrible. How can a man think so little of his fellow man?
Apparently I was wrong. Apparently there's not 15,000 people here today. I'm sorry. Apparently it's something more like 20, 25,000 people. A woman who I'm very proud to call a friend and comrade, UBC student and PSG member, Itrat Syed. Let's welcome her.
We are here to say that we refuse to believe the lies they tell us. We refuse to be lulled into silence and complicity by the fairy tales they construct, where the world is divided between the uncivilized demon hordes of the East and the noble civilized armies of the West. We are here to say that we refuse to believe in a world divided by fear and hate.
Itrat Syed has always had a voice in the non-Muslim world, but she finds it more difficult to be heard in her own community.
My activism within the Muslim community is not all that I do in the world, right? I also have been working in the anti-violence movement for like 7 or 8 years. I also, you know, am a feminist in the world and deal with feminist issues outside of the Muslim community. You know, and I could talk any feminist, you know, I could talk a circle around any feminist. So the idea that is this rolling?
حي للصلاة حي للصلاة حي للفلاح حي للفلاح قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله.
You know, if you're sitting in a separate prayer hall and you're looking over to where the actual congregation is, it is a sense that you're not part of that congregation. You can't participate. You can send a note on a piece of paper to be read downstairs to ask a question. But that's not the same thing as being able to stand up and being able to speak and be heard. And that's like a big part of why it feels so, why it doesn't sit well with so many women that I know, that it feels so uncomfortable and so, and that we feel so excluded. And as a result, a lot of women of my generation, I think, have left the organized community. It's not something that I can completely divorce myself from, but it's something that I have to struggle with. What is the meaning given to this? Why is this deemed to be necessary? What does this say about how we understand women and how we understand women's bodies? And I think that implicit in this need that people feel for segregation is an understanding that women's bodies are in and of themselves inherently offensive.
In the original Surrey Mosque, women weren't allowed in at all. After the mosque burned down, the community put pressure on the mosque leadership to allow women in the new building. Sharif Senbul is the architect hired to design the new mosque. The leadership wanted separate prayer areas for the men and women. I went upstairs with Sharif to see the women's gallery.
So this is going to be solid?
This is it.